We talked about the Bitcoin ETF kind of aging like wine, and there's this extra nuance in the ETH ETF that it actually has its own endogenous reason why it would improve over time. And that's because I think in the fullness of time, we will see staking be a part of the Ethereum ETF. And so in addition to all the regular TradFi just needs to absorb it, comprehend it, figure out how to filter it out to all of its like distribution arms, which are the brokerages, the advisors, et cetera. There's also the evolution of the ETH ETF itself, I would assume would start at the vanilla ETH asset and then evolve into a staked ETH asset in the fullness of time. Matt, do you agree that this is like the long-term conclusion of the ETH ETF, just to really start this conversation?
100%. That's exactly right. And you're right. It will probably start without staking. And you're right that it will add it over time. That's what investors want.
And is that like a trivial evolution, or is this going to take like another number of years in order to get like the SEC and regulators and just people on board with this?
So I don't know is the answer, but I'd be surprised if it was years. A year seems like a more reasonable number, right? They're not certain. They're likely to go with the simplest version first because that's what you do when you're getting something new out the door. Think of it as an MVP of an ETF, right? It's a minimum viable product. I don't think it's that far of a leap to staking, and you can see it used in other markets around the world. But I do think it's a year, it's 18 months, it's something on that timeline if I were forced to guess.
I would just add to that, I think an analogy you can make here with the vanilla and then getting more complex from there is other ETFs that initially launch, whether it's Bitcoin ETFs or simple ETFs, that you then have short or inverse ETFs launched that are focused on those products. You then have leveraged ETFs launched that are focused on those products. And so you tend to always have this kind of simple approach first, and then you get more complex out there. And so while staking is a little bit more complicated than just creating a leveraged or inverse ETF, I wouldn't be so shocked that we see the ability to have a staked Ethereum ETF in the future. It's kicking a dividend down to the investors ultimately, which again is good for the investors. And as long as you disclose the risks in the fund prospectus and all of that documents, really it's up to the investor to make that decision, and the SEC shouldn't be playing gatekeeper when it comes to that. And so I think we'll eventually get there, but definitely we'll have that vanilla ETH ETF before we have anything.
Man, Ryan, I think you just opened up like a whole entire like rabbit hole of like ETF permutations, ETF derivatives. Like what kind of like spark our imaginations here? What kind of other types of crypto ETFs, merely even just off the Bitcoin or the ETH assets? What types would you expect to see emerge on the floor like sooner rather than later?
I think if you look at the futures ETFs, we had Bitcoin futures ETFs, we had Ethereum futures ETFs, then you have maybe 50-50 ETH futures and Bitcoin futures ETFs that just split it down the middle, so that with the purchase of one share of an ETF, you have 50% exposure to Bitcoin, you have 50% exposure to Ethereum. You could have that as a market weighted ETF, or you could have some sort of moving average built into that fund where it trades in and out of one and into the other based on moving averages. We also will have options for the Bitcoin ETF soon, which will unlock an entirely new category of demand and traders, and call it Wall Street bets or just institutions that love buying and selling options. I think that'll bring new demand into the market, and so covered call strategies, ETFs will emerge, and all kinds of fun things like that. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens to inverse Bitcoin ETFs when those hit the market.
Beautiful. I want to get back into some more questions about just the nature of the ETH ETF. I know this is like starting to get into like some fog of war stuff. We just don't really have too many answers or clarity here. But Matt, any insight on like how the staking mechanism would actually work inside of a staked ETH ETF? Is this like, what's the most likely outcome here? Like ETH is just basically going to be staked by Coinbase. Is this going to be like a Lido staked ETH denominated ETF? Like, do you have any sort of insight as to how the yield actually gets into an ETF?
Really complex question, made more complex by the fact that the structure of these ETFs is something called a grantor trust, which you can sort of think of as a box that doesn't want to do anything. All grantor trusts want to do is just sort of sit there. And so making a grantor trust do something like stake ETH is complex. I think it's liable to be at the custodial level. That's the most likely outcome. Is sort of through the custodial level. The analogy, for what it's worth, there is an analogy in traditional equity ETFs. So what many traditional equity ETFs do that hold like Tesla stock or Apple stock, et cetera, is they actually lend that stock out to short sellers and earn a yield on it. And that's typically done, through the issuer or through the custodian. And I think the similar model will apply here, but we don't know for sure yet.
And then the last question, and I think is like the most important question about this whole ETF thing, when it comes to ETH, is of course the price impact on it. ETH is of course 1/3 of the market cap of Bitcoin. It also has less ETH on secondary markets, simply because there's plenty of ETH in DeFi, plenty of ETH on layer 2s, plenty of ETH in Eigenlayer. Do you have any sort of notion as to like how the relative price impact would be on Ether, on an Ether ETF in comparison to what we've seen in the Bitcoin ETF? Do you have any sort of commentary on this, Matt?
Great question. Look, I think ETH ETFs will gather billions of dollars of long-term capital that buys it and holds it. And ETH market cap is not that large. So over time, I think the impact could be really significant. I still don't think, right now, I'm not sure that the ETF tail is what's wagging the Ethereum dog. I really still think it's the use cases and the technological progress, which has been massive and overwhelming. And maybe I'm just so bullish on the growth of those things that I think that that's more important than the ETF. I think of the ETF as like a nice, important catalyst that will impact price.
Future catalyst, not current catalyst.
Future catalyst that will impact price. But ETH has other really important catalysts, almost in a way that Bitcoin doesn't, right? Bitcoin has the halving. But the ETF was really important for Bitcoin because it's fundamentally a store of value, and that's its use case. Ethereum has so many use cases, and the technological story is so good right now, and the app development is so exciting right now that I think that's probably the primary driver. But look, it'll be billions of dollars. It'll impact price. I'm really bullish on ETH.
Okay, so Bitcoin is 50 billion right now, and we're expecting maybe by the end of the year it could flip gold. What do we think if we got an Ethereum ETF? Do you think it would be comparable to that? Do you think it would be smaller? Some have described this as sort of it's more like the opener, right? And whereas people go to the concert for Bitcoin, and this is just kind of a side act, right? And it's not going to accrue nearly the interest that the Bitcoin ETF would. And they point to, I think, the Ethereum futures, which have been fairly paltry to this point. What do you think of that argument, Matt? And what are your expectations for a future Ethereum ETF?
They'll be way more successful than the Ethereum futures ETFs were, which were very disappointing. Those launched at a nadir in the market and a period of disinterest, and they were rushed to market. So I don't know that that's a good analogy. I don't think they'll be out of the gate as big as Bitcoin, but I think, they'll attract billions of dollars in their first year. That's my guess. I also think they'll have a slower ramp in terms of their terminal flows will be more upward sloping, because there's more education around Ethereum than there is around Bitcoin. But I think it'll be billions of dollars. Look, I think they'll be very successful. And you'll have BlackRock, and you'll have Bitwise, and you'll have others talking about Ethereum and real world use cases. I think it'll be broadly additive for the space. But I don't think it'll be, $50 billion in year one. It'll be billions. It'll be a success.
Ryan, you're on the front lines of institutional education here, and you've certainly been doing your share of education around Bitcoin. I'm not sure what narrative is sticking the most, but if I had to guess, it'd be like, store of value, hedge against the dollar. We've talked about some of those things here. Digital gold, that seems to be a lasting meme that you can kind of transport. How do you think the Ethereum narrative will land among that crowd? Like, what words will you use? What analogies, what narratives do you think are the stickiest for that tribe?
I think you got to look at it like a technology investment. That tends to resonate the most with the advisors that we're talking about when we explain what Ethereum is. We don't get so into the weeds of it's a blockchain that's a decentralized database that allows anyone to build any kind of decentralized application with smart contracts. You kind of zoom out and you say, look, this is a new technology platform that's going to fundamentally change the way that we interact with each other, that companies interact with their customers, and that we interact with data and value online in a way that Bitcoin just today can't touch. And when you talk about it like that, and then you get into things like emerging AI and other kind of technology narratives that are emerging, blockchains don't seem that crazy, and Ethereum doesn't seem that crazy. And the more it becomes a household name, the more that people are talking about that as they talk about Bitcoin when they go on CNBC or Fox Business News, the more that word Ethereum comes into the mainstream and the minds of investors. And really, you just need to educate them on the potential use cases on top of Ethereum. If you have this decentralized internet, look what you can do with stablecoins. Look what you can do with things like Farcaster or prediction markets, and that starts to really get the wheels turning in their head of, oh man, if I could have invested in the internet in the 90s or in the early 2000s, what would that have looked like for my portfolio, for my clients' portfolios? And maybe it's not so crazy to carve off a bigger part of your technology sleeve to invest in Ethereum than what you're doing with your alt sleeve to invest in Bitcoin. And that's where I think we'll really start to see the demand for Ethereum ETFs when they launch is, okay, now this thing's real. We have an ETF around it that is issued by some of the largest asset managers in the world. And if I invest in that ETF, I have exposure to this new technology platform where there's thousands of developers and millions of users and thousands of applications being launched and being used every single day. And all I have to do is buy this one asset, invest in this one asset. I don't have to pick the individual winners. It's kind of it's an index on that future growth of the crypto ecosystem beyond just a store of value. And I think when you talk about it like that, you start to see them really, start to turn the page on what's possible with this technology. You don't have to understand everything it does and everything that will happen on it to know that it will have a fundamental impact on the way that we interact with technology in the future. And that's really the best selling point that I've seen resonate when I'm talking to advisors and walking them through it.
Okay, so you're basically saying this is a piece of the internet, maybe the decentralized internet, that's part of the narrative. When it comes to valuation, though, did they think about this as like a tech play, like similar to maybe an Amazon high growth tech stock, or like how do you talk about valuation? I'm wondering if specifically the meme that we've been working on, that some others have been kind of working on for narrative understanding, is like the internet bond, right? This thing does have a yield. It is sort of a share of the internet. Do you think that has a chance, or is that too far? Is that a bridge too far, Ryan?
No, I think that has a chance. We kind of talk about it in two ways. We say, look, in some ways, when there's more and more activity on this network, you start to have this burn mechanism, which acts a lot like a share buyback, right? And traditional investors can understand share buybacks. The largest companies in the world spend billions of dollars buying their shares off the market to reduce the flow and to reduce the supply. And you have the same thing happening when ETH is being burned, when usage goes up. So we talk about there's value accrual from the fact that you have this burn mechanism, which is very similar to a share buyback. And then we talk about the yield from staking, which is very similar to a dividend. And when you put it into analogies they can understand that are very similar to investment in dividend stocks or in stocks that do share buybacks, they can really start to see how value will start to accrue to the underlying asset. And so an internet bond is a great way to think about it. I think simpler terms for financial advisors who really think about things from a cash flow, value accrual, dividend perspective also works.
Does the 1-2 punch of a asset that has a native stock buyback component to it that is also yielding dividends at the same time? Because like both of these things are great in silo, but the cool thing about ETH is that you get both. You get a deflationary asset that's also producing yield. Does that 1-2 punch land, or how do people react to that?
I think that 1-2 punch lands. It's kind of like the setup for the haymaker, which is then when you show them the revenue that Ethereum's generating, it's billions of dollars in revenue every single year. And so I think those three things together, it's like, sure, great, there's a buyback and sure, there's a dividend, but where's all that actually coming from and what's going to make that happen? You say, well, look, here's thousands of applications, here's millions of users, here's billions in revenue being generated on this platform. Then they have that aha moment and they really start to understand this isn't going away. It's only going to get bigger, and I should have some exposure to this on behalf of my clients.
What we're really asking you for, Ryan, is that you would take David and myself on the road with you so we can, help fight the good fight and convince some folks. Matt, what would you add to this discussion around kind of narratives and positioning of Ether, the asset, for the institutional tribe?
Yeah, I think you all have touched it really well. I mean, the beautiful thing about that buyback and dividend thing is it puts it into familiar ground, right? It makes it just like a stock, and it makes it like an early stage technology investment, which all of these people are used to. And that just makes it very comfortable. There is a set of institutional investors who will never be comfortable with Bitcoin because it doesn't have those characteristics. And this makes Ethereum very comfortable for them. I'd also add that, most of these people are 45, 50, 60 years old, and they experienced the rise of the internet from something that was weird and quirky and no one used to something that they use every day. And so this is a narrative that fits in their mind with historical patterns. And I think that's really valuable as well. Those analogies really work with this audience.
If you enjoyed all of that, then you'll absolutely love the Bankless newsletter. Join over 300,000 fellow readers, all for free. Click below to sign up.